Avenor Blake had exactly 35 minutes before her flight to New York began boarding at Incheon International, and she had just committed what felt like a digital suicide. She had texted her boss, former boss, as of the moment she handed in her master key, 10 words that she had buried under layers of domestic silence for 3 long years. I wish I didn't have to go. I've belonged to you for 3 years. Her smartphone felt like a live wire in her hand, the screen dark and mocking in the sterile light of the Terminal 1 lounge. She'd sent it 4 minutes ago. 4 minutes of soul-crushing silence while the PA system droned on in Korean and English, and tourists moved past her like shadows. She was a fool. Avenor, the invisible maid, the girl who moved through a Mafia don's house like a ghost, had finally made herself seen. And in his world, being seen was often a death sentence. The phone buzzed. Avenor's heart nearly burst against her ribs. She didn't just grab the phone, she clung to it as if it were a life raft. His name didn't appear as Mr. Kong or the boss. It was just a black void on her screen that had never messaged her first. Until now. Stay. In. Place. 3 words. Not a request, but a command from a man who treated the world like a chessboard. Avenor stared at the screen until the pixels blurred. The 3 dots of his typing appeared, flickered, and vanished, leaving her breathless. Then, Gate 22. Do not board. I am 5 minutes away. Avenor felt the air leave the terminal. He was coming. Kong Min-jae, a man who wouldn't stop a multi-billion-dollar drug shipment for the police, was breaking a summit for a maid. Final boarding call for flight KE-081, the gate agent announced. Avenor sat paralyzed, her boarding pass damp with sweat in her left hand, while her carefully constructed escape plan turned to ash. 6 hours earlier, the Kong estate had felt like a mausoleum. Avenor had been folding the last of his silk shirts, her fingers tracing the expensive fabric one last time. For 3 years, she had translated his silence, known exactly how he liked his tea, and seen the blood on his cuffs that he thought she ignored. She was leaving because the weight of loving a man who lived in the shadows was crushing her. She thought she was just a ghost leaving a haunted house. She didn't realize that in Kong Min-jae's eyes, she was the only thing in the house that had ever been alive. Avenor stood in the silent expanse of the master study, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold metallic ink clinging to the air. It was a smell she had memorized over 3 years, one that signaled the presence of Kong Min-jae before he even entered a room. As she meticulously polished the mahogany desk, her movements were fluid and practiced, the movements of a woman who had learned to exist in the periphery of power without ever disturbing its surface. For 3 years, Avenor had been the invisible shadow of the Kong estate. To the rest of the staff, she was the quiet American who followed the rules and never gossiped. To the lethal men who guarded the perimeter, she was merely part of the furniture. But to Min-jae, she was the only person in his world who didn't look at him with a mask of terror or a calculated lie. She remembered the first time she had truly seen him. It was a Tuesday, 6 months into her employment. Min-jae had returned from a meeting in the middle of the night, his knuckles split and his tailored suit jacket ruined by a spray of dark red that no amount of dry cleaning could fix. The rest of the household had scurried away, afraid to witness the monster's fatigue. But Avenor had simply stepped forward with a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. When he had looked up, his dark, intense eyes had been like flint, searching for the flinch that usually followed his gaze. Avenor hadn't moved. She hadn't looked down at his blood-stained hands or the geometric ink that snaked up his neck. She had looked him directly in the eye, her gaze steady and filled with a quiet, grounding strength. In that moment, the power dynamic had shifted. He wasn't the Mafia boss, and she wasn't the maid, they were simply 2 souls trapped in a house built on secrets. Since then, she had become his silent confidant without ever exchanging a personal word. She knew the exact shade of gray his eyes turned when he was exhausted. She knew that he preferred his tea bitter and that he only touched the piano in the foyer when the weight of his empire became too heavy to carry. She had watched him command rooms full of hardened criminals with nothing but a whisper, and she had been the one to silently refill his glass when the room finally emptied. He had come to depend on her presence, a steady, unyielding anchor in a sea of violent chaos. He never asked her to stay in the room, but he never asked her to leave either. It was a dangerous game of professional boundaries that had slowly, agonizingly, eroded over 1,000 small moments. Avenor had realized she was no longer just maintaining his home, she was maintaining him. And that realization was precisely why she had tried to run. Loving a man like Kang Min-jae was like trying to hold a flame in your bare hands. You could only stay warm for so long before you started to burn. As she wiped the last of the dust from the desk where he had signed death warrants and billion-dollar deals alike, she felt the phantom weight of her phone in her pocket. The invisible shadow was about to step into the light, and she knew that once the sun hit her, there would be no going back. The air in Terminal 1 was thick with the sterile scent of jet fuel and the low, anxious hum of 1,000 travelers, but for Avenor, the world had narrowed down to the glowing screen of her phone. Stay. In. Place. The command vibrated against her palm, a digital tether pulling her back toward the life she had just tried to strip off like a worn-out uniform. Around her, the boarding process for Flight KE-081 was a blur of scanning passes and polite nods, a gateway to a freedom that was rapidly dissolving. Suddenly, the rhythmic pulse of the airport shattered. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the departure lounge, the usual orderly flow of luggage tugs and fuel trucks drifted into chaos. A line of 3 obsidian black SUVs breached the tarmac gates, tires screeching against the asphalt in a blatant violation of every security protocol in Seoul. They didn't park, they intercepted, flanking the nose of the very Boeing 777 that was meant to carry Avenor across the Pacific. Inside the terminal, the atmosphere shifted from travel fatigue to a cold, prickling fear. Security guards froze, their radios crackling with frantic, confused reports, but no one moved to intervene. They recognized the emblem on the lead vehicle. They recognized the man who stepped out into the harsh afternoon sun, his dark overcoat billowing like a shroud. Kang Min-jae didn't look like a man in a hurry, he looked like a god reclaiming a lost prayer. Avenor stood frozen by the gate, her fingers white-knuckled around the handle of her solitary suitcase. The automatic doors to the terminal hissed open, and the crowd parted like a retreating tide. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrifying. Min-jae walked toward her, the rhythmic click of his Italian leather shoes on the polished tile echoing like a countdown. His dark hair was perfectly slicked back, but his eyes, those intense, predatory eyes, were burning with a raw, uncharacteristic turbulence. He stopped inches from her, his presence an invisible wall that blocked out the rest of the world. He didn't look at the travelers filming on their phones or the trembling gate agents. He looked only at Avenor. His hand, marked by the geometric ink that told stories of blood and betrayal, reached out. He didn't grab her, he simply wrapped his fingers firmly around her wrist, lifting her hand and the phone she still clutched until their gazes were locked. "You sent a text," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the air in her lungs vanish. "You told me you belonged to me, Avenor. Did you think I would let you take what is mine to the other side of the world?" "I was leaving for your own good, Min-jae," she whispered, her voice trembling but her eyes refusing to flinch, maintaining that 3-year-old habit of looking him in the face. "Nothing in this world is for my own good," he countered, his grip tightening just enough to be felt, a silent assertion of control. "Except for the girl who knows how I take my tea and how I hide my scars." He turned, never letting go of her wrist, and began to lead her back toward the exit. Behind them, the world watched in stunned silence as the most powerful man in the underworld claimed a woman the world saw as a maid, but whom he saw as his son. The flight was forgotten. The escape was over. As they stepped out into the waiting motorcade, Avenor realized that by sending that text, she hadn't just stayed in Korea, she had stepped forever into the center of a storm. The drive back to the Kong estate was conducted in a heavy, pressurized silence that felt more intimate than any conversation. Min Jae did not let go of Avanor's wrist until the armored SUV came to a halt beneath the grand portico of the mansion. When the doors opened, the staff was already lined up, their heads bowed in a terrified, choreographed display of respect. Avanor expected to be led to the service entrance, to the small, sterile room where she had spent 3 years tucked away like a secret. Instead, Min Jae's hand moved to the small of her back, guiding her toward the grand sweeping staircase that led to the private upper levels, the forbidden sanctum of the house. The heavy double doors to the master's quarters groaned open, revealing a world of dark velvet, cold marble, and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the sprawling city of Seoul. This was the center of his world, the place where the most dangerous decisions in the country were made. Avanor stopped at the threshold, her breath hitching. The room was beautiful, but it was also a fortress. "This isn't where I belong," she whispered, her voice echoing in the vast, silent space. Min Jae stepped into her personal space, his presence overwhelming the scent of the room. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a gentleness that was far more frightening than his anger. "You told me you have belonged to me for 3 years, Avanor. You were wrong. You didn't belong to the house. You didn't belong to the job." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a gravelly, possessive low. "You belong in my space. Where I can see you when I wake and hear you while I work. The maid is gone. You are staying here." Avanor looked around the room, seeing the artifacts of a man who lived a life of brutal isolation. There were no photos, no personal trinkets, only the tools of his trade and the luxury he used as armor. Now, her small, battered suitcase sat in the middle of the silk Persian rug, a stark, humble intrusion into his perfection. She realized then that this wasn't just a change of rooms, it was a rebranding. By placing her here, he was announcing to the entire underworld that she was no longer a shadow. She was the heart of the fortress. "They will kill me for this," she said, looking at him with the wide, honest eyes that had always been her only weapon. "Your people, they won't accept a maid in this room." Min Jae's expression hardened, his sharp facial features catching the dying light of the sunset. He reached out and caught her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, the geometric tattoos on his knuckles pressing against her soft skin. "Then I will give them a reason to fear the room as much as they fear me," he promised. He led her toward the balcony, the city lights reflecting in his intense, unwavering gaze. "The world is going to watch us, Avanor. Let them. But you are never going back to the shadows." As the door clicked shut behind them, locking them into a world of high-stakes luxury and unspoken danger, Avanor felt the weight of her choice. She had traded her freedom for a throne in a lion's den, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't just feel like a maid. She felt like a catalyst. The following evening, the master suite was bathed in the amber glow of a dying fire. Min Jae sat in a velvet armchair, his posture less like a king and more like a soldier returning from a long, exhausting war. He had spent the day in the underworld, and the tension was visible in the way his jaw remained locked even in the silence of his private quarters. Avanor approached him with a small medical kit, her eyes catching a fresh, jagged cut across his knuckles, a reminder that his life was written in violence. As she knelt before him, the silence between them was no longer the heavy, professional quiet of a maid and her employer. It was the charged, breathless air of 2 people standing on a precipice. She took his hand in hers, her skin deep-toned and soft against his pale, scarred flesh. For the first time, she didn't just look at the geometric ink that spanned from his wrist to his fingertips, she touched it. Min Jae's breath hitched, but he didn't pull away. In 3 years, Avanor had seen 100 men try to touch his hands in a show of loyalty or power, and he had always recoiled with a lethal coldness. But under her fingertips, his muscles relaxed. "The patterns," Avanor whispered, her thumb tracing a sharp, triangular line near his thumb. "They aren't just art. They're a map." Min Jae looked down at their joined hands, his expression softening into something painfully human. In my world, we don't have family trees, Avenor. We have debts. Every line you see represents a life taken or a life saved. The triangles at the base of my wrist? That was the night my father was betrayed. The interlocking circles on my palm? The day I took over the Kong line to keep my sister safe. He turned his hand over, his fingers curling slightly around hers. No one is allowed to touch these because to touch the ink is to touch my history. It's to see the blood I haven't washed off yet. Avenor didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned down and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the scarred knuckles of his right hand. I've been washing the blood off your floors for 3 years, Min Jae. I'm not afraid of your history. The air in the room seemed to vibrate. Min Jae reached out with his other hand, his fingers tangling in her shoulder-length hair, pulling her just close enough to feel the heat radiating from his skin. The unmistakable air of control he usually carried was crumbling. You are the only person who doesn't look at this ink and see a monster, he murmured, his forehead resting against hers. I see a man who survived, she corrected. In that moment, the professional boundaries they had spent years building didn't just break, they evaporated. As Min Jae leaned in to bridge the final inch between them, Avenor realized that by reading his ink, she had become the keeper of his soul. He wasn't just her boss or a mafia king, he was a man who had finally found the one person capable of holding the weight of his past without breaking. The kiss was desperate and long overdue, a collision of two worlds that should never have met, yet now felt impossible to separate. The dining room of the Kong estate was a cavern of cold marble and sharp edges, illuminated by a chandelier that dripped with crystal-like frozen tears. Avenor stood at the top of the stairs, her pulse a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. She was no longer wearing the dark, understated fabrics of a maid, Min Jae had seen to that. She was draped in a floor-length silk gown the color of midnight, a garment that felt like armor and a target all at once. Min Jae waited at the foot of the stairs, his dark suit perfectly tailored, his expression a mask of lethal indifference. But when he reached for her hand, the heat of his touch was a silent promise. He led her into the room where 12 of his highest-ranking lieutenants, men who handled the blood and the billions, sat around a table that had only ever seen the business of death. As they entered, the room fell into a silence so absolute it was suffocating. These were men who had seen Avenor hundreds of times. She was the girl who had cleared their empty whiskey glasses, the ghost who had wiped the ash from their cigars. To see her now, standing at the right hand of the dragon, was a sacrilege they couldn't yet process. Min Jae didn't pull out a chair for her. He simply remained standing, his hand resting possessively on her shoulder, his gaze sweeping the table like a blade. For 3 years, he began, his voice a low, terrifying vibration, you have seen Avenor Blake as a shadow in this house. You have treated her as a servant to your needs. One of the older lieutenants, a man with a jagged scar across his throat, shifted uncomfortably. Min Jae, she is a maid. This is... Min Jae's hand tightened on Avenor's shoulder. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She is the woman who knows the contents of my heart better than you know the contents of your own ledgers. She is the only person in this world I trust. And in my world, trust is more valuable than territory. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto each man in turn. From this moment forward, you will not look at her as the girl who pours your wine. You will look at her as the person who decides if you are worthy of sitting at this table. Avenor felt the weight of their collective stares, a mixture of disbelief, resentment, and a new, flickering flame of fear. She didn't look down. She maintained the steady, unyielding gaze she had perfected over 3 years of looking into the eyes of a monster. Bow, Min Jae commanded. It wasn't a request. It was a test of loyalty. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, the man with the scarred throat slowly stood, followed by the others. One by one, the 12 most dangerous men in the Korean underworld lowered their heads in a sharp, synchronized bow toward the woman who had once been invisible. Avenor's breath caught. The power in the room had shifted, settling onto her shoulders like a heavy, gilded cloak. She realized then that Min Jae wasn't just protecting her, he was weaponizing her. As they sat down to a dinner that felt more like a coronation, she saw the dark glint in Min Jae's eyes. He had forced them to acknowledge her, but in doing so, he had invited the entire underworld to try and tear her down. She was no longer a maid, and she was no longer safe. She was a queen in a den of wolves. The transition from invisible maid to the Mafia's centerpiece was never going to be a peaceful one. As Avenor settled into her new life, the shadows of her past began to reach across the ocean. While the Korean underworld was a world of cold precision and ancient tradition, the streets of New York, where she had grown up, were ruled by a different kind of chaos, one that had just found its way to Seoul. It happened during a quiet afternoon while Min Jae was away at a high-stakes territory negotiation. Avenor was in the master's suite, the scent of his sandalwood cologne still lingering in the air, when her personal phone, the one she had used to send that life-changing text, vibrated with an unknown number. It wasn't a text from Min Jae. It was a video file from a burner phone located in Brooklyn. With trembling fingers, she pressed play. The grainy footage showed her younger brother, Marcus, being shoved into the back of a nondescript van outside their mother's apartment. A voice, thick with a heavy, unidentified accent, spoke over the footage. "The maid has a new crown. We want the price of the jewels." Avenor felt the blood drain from her face, her knees hitting the plush Persian rug. Her past, the very thing she had tried to protect by working in silence for 3 years, was now being liquidated by a rival syndicate that saw her as Min Jae's only vulnerability. They didn't want money, they wanted leverage. They wanted the man who refused to let her leave to surrender his grip on the Incheon ports in exchange for her brother's life. When Min Jae returned an hour later, he didn't need to ask what was wrong. He found Avenor standing by the window, the phone clutched in her hand like a weapon. The unmistakable air of control that usually defined him sharpened into something lethal as he watched the video. He didn't erupt in a rage, instead, he became terrifyingly still, his eyes tracking the geometric ink on his own hand as if consulting a map of previous vengeances. "I told you they would use me," Avenor whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "I should have boarded that plane. I should have stayed invisible." Min Jae walked over and took the phone from her hand, his gaze locking onto hers with a dangerous, unwavering intensity. He reached out, his thumb tracing the side of her neck where a pulse was fluttering like a trapped bird. "They didn't take him because you are a maid, Avenor. They took him because you are mine. And they are about to learn that I do not negotiate for what belongs to me." He turned to his lead security detail, his voice a low, cold command that resonated through the suite. "Call the New York cells. Tell them the Kong line is coming to Brooklyn. And find out which rival gave them the tip. I want their names before the sun sets." Avenor watched him, realizing that the American ransom had changed the game. She wasn't just a girl in love with a monster anymore, she was the reason the monster was about to go to war. The stakes had shifted from her heart to her bloodline, and as Min Jae began to coordinate a cross-continental strike, Avenor realized that to save her family, she would have to fully embrace the dark world she had once tried to flee. The war room in the depths of the Kong estate was a sharp contrast to the velvet-draped luxury of the master suite. Here, the air was cold, recycled, and heavy with the hum of high-end servers and the staccato tapping of tactical analysts. Avenor stood in the corner, her arms wrapped around her middle, watching the man she loved transform. Min Jae was no longer the man who traced her jaw with a tender thumb. He stood over a digital map of Brooklyn, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screens. His orders were clipped, surgical, and utterly devoid of mercy. He was coordinating a series of interrogations across 3 continents to find the men who had touched her brother, and the casual way he discussed eliminating liabilities made the bile rise in Avenor's throat. She had spent 3 years cleaning his floors, but she had always looked away from the source of the stains. She had told herself he was a man forced into a dark role. Now, as she watched him authorize a strike that would leave dozens of families grieving, the truth shattered her carefully constructed denial. She didn't just love a man with a dangerous job, she loved a monster who ruled a kingdom of blood. "You're trembling," Min-jae said, his voice cutting through the hum of the room without him even looking up from the monitors. He walked over to her, the unmistakable air of control radiating from him like a physical heat. He took her hands, but this time, he didn't hide the split knuckles or the coldness of his intent. "Does the reality of my world finally taste bitter, Avenor?" "It tastes like death," she whispered, her wide eyes searching his for a flicker of the man who had called her treasure in his silence. "How can you do this? How can you speak about lives as if they're just numbers on a ledger?" Min-jae leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, forcing her to look into the abyss of his intense, unwavering gaze. "Because those numbers are the only thing keeping your brother alive. Because in this underworld, mercy is just another word for weakness. I am a monster so that you don't have to be. But if you want to stay by my side, if you want to be the woman who wears my ring, you have to decide if you can live with the blood on my hands. Or better yet, if you're willing to get some on your own to protect what's ours." He pulled a small, silver-plated handgun from his waistband and pressed it into her palm. It was heavy, cold, and felt like a lead weight in her hand. "The men who took Marcus are coming for us tonight. I can send you back to the airport, Avenor. I can give you a new name and a quiet life where you never have to see another stain. Or you can stay, and you can be the monster's queen." Avenor looked down at the weapon, then at the geometric ink on his hand, the map of his sins. She realized that the invisible shadow was truly dead. She could run and live a half-life of fear, or she could embrace the darkness that had already claimed her heart. The emotional arc of the last 3 years reached its zenith in that cold room. Slowly, her fingers closed around the grip of the gun. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She looked at Min-jae and saw not just the monster, but the only home she had ever known. "Teach me," she said, her voice a low, steady vow. "Teach me how to protect what's mine." The shift was absolute. She wasn't just his maid, and she wasn't just his lover. She was becoming his equal in the only language the underworld understood, the language of blood. The Grand Hyatt's private ballroom was a masterclass in tension, a room full of men who traded in territories and lives as if they were nothing more than chips on a felt table. Min-jae sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his expression a mask of calm but dangerous authority. Avenor was behind him, once again dressed in the dark, understated clothing of a personal assistant. To the rival bosses and the treacherous council of elders, she had faded back into the woodwork, a silent shadow they had already dismissed. But Avenor was no longer just watching the tea service. She was watching the room. For 3 years, she had survived by noticing the things men in power ignored. She knew the rhythm of a man's breathing when he was lying. She knew the subtle shift in a shoulder before a weapon was drawn. As the summit coup began to unfold, the air in the room grew heavy with a metallic, ozone scent. It was the smell of an impending strike. Min-jae was deep in a heated negotiation with the head of the Busan syndicate, their voices low and sharp. The elders sat in the corner, their eyes hooded, their silence too profound to be anything but a trap. Avenor scanned the room, her gaze lingering on the waitstaff. There, near the service entrance, a man she didn't recognize was moving with a rigid precision that didn't match the flow of the room. He wasn't looking at the glasses, he was looking at the back of Min-jae's head. In the underworld, the greatest weapon isn't a gun, it's the person no one notices. As the Busan boss stood up to make a final, aggressive point, the distraction was set. Avenor saw the waiter's hand dip into the fold of his jacket. Without a second of hesitation, her invisible skills, the speed she had developed moving through the Kong estate undetected, took over. She didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She lunged. Her body collided with Min-jae's chair just as the first suppressed shot whistled through the space where his head had been a millisecond before. The room erupted into a symphony of crashing glass and shouted orders. Avenor felt the weight of the silver-plated handgun Min Jae had given her in the war room, but she didn't need it yet. Her hand shot out, grabbing a heavy crystal decanter from the table and hurling it with desperate accuracy at the assassin's face. The distraction was enough. Min Jae's hand, marked by the geometric ink of 1,000 previous battles, was already drawing his own weapon. He didn't look at the assassin, he looked at Avenor, his intense eyes wide with a rare, visceral shock. He hadn't expected the maid to be his shield. The security detail swarmed the room, and the coup was crushed in a matter of seconds, leaving the elders trapped in their own silence. Min Jae stood amidst the chaos, his breathing heavy, his gaze locked onto Avenor as she stood over the fallen assassin, her posture upright but tense, her eyes reflecting a quiet strength and emotional tension. "You saw him," Min Jae murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the ringing in her ears. "I've spent 3 years seeing everything you miss, Min Jae," she replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. In that moment, the council realized their mistake. They had thought Avenor was Min Jae's weakness, a liability to be used against him. They didn't realize she was his greatest asset. She had saved the monster's life, not with force, but with the very invisibility they had forced upon her. As Min Jae reached out and gripped her hand firmly, asserting his control over the room and her life once again, Avenor realized there was no turning back. She had drawn blood to save the crown, and the price of that salvation was a permanent seat by his side. The aftermath of the summit left the estate in a state of clinical, high-alert silence. Marcus had been recovered in a surgical strike, shaken, but alive, and was already under the protection of Min Jae's New York cells. The threat that had tethered Avenor to the darkness out of necessity was gone. Now, only the weight of her own heart remained. She found Min Jae in the master's study, the room where she had spent 3 years as a ghost. He wasn't sitting at the desk. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over a city he owned, yet appearing more solitary than she had ever seen him. On the mahogany surface behind him lay 2 items that seemed too small to hold the gravity of a life, her American passport and a first-class ticket to JFK, dated for the following morning. Avenor stopped at the threshold, her upright but tense posture reflecting the inner conflict that had become her constant companion. "I thought you said I belonged to you," she said, her voice a soft, echoing challenge in the vast room. Min Jae turned, his sharp facial features catching the moonlight. He didn't move toward her. He stayed behind the desk, the barrier between their worlds momentarily re-established. "I said I refused to let you leave, Avenor. I never said I would keep you as a prisoner." He gestured toward the passport with a hand marked by the geometric ink she now knew by heart. "You have seen the monster in full light. You have held the weapon. You have tasted the blood of this life." His gaze was locked onto her face, unwavering and intense. "The threat to your family is neutralized. You can go back to being the girl who is invisible, the girl who is safe. You can go back to a world where tea is just tea and silence is just silence." Avenor walked toward the desk, her hand hovering over the passport. This was the freedom she had prayed for at Incheon Airport. This was the escape from the violence and the underworld that threatened to consume her soul. But as she looked at the ticket, she didn't feel relief. She felt a profound, hollow ache. "And what happens to you?" she asked. Min Jae's expression remained calm, but dangerous, a mask he wore for the world, yet one she could finally see through. "I continue. I rule. I live in the shadows I was born into." He paused, his voice dropping to a gravelly, raw vibration. "But the house will be a mausoleum again. And I will be a man who once knew what it felt like to be alive." The silence stretched between them.